I used to believe forgetting a birthday was just a mistake, an oversight, a bad day at work, a missed notification. But when it's your husband who forgets, it feels different. It's not about the candles or the cake, it's about the silence, the kind that tells you without a single word that you've stopped being someone worth remembering.
That morning, I woke up early. I had this ridiculous habit of pretending to still be asleep whenever he stirred, just so I could feel him kiss my forehead before leaving for work. He always did. Until that day. No kiss, no whisper, just the sound of his shoes, the jingle of his keys, and the door clicking shut behind him. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Maybe he was planning something. I told myself that. Maybe there'd be flowers on the counter when I came down. A message, a hint, something. But the kitchen was empty. No card, no breakfast, no note, just his half-finished coffee and the faint scent of the cologne he always wore when he wanted to impress someone. That was my first clue. Not that I admitted it to myself yet. Denial is a beautiful thing when you're still trying to protect what's already crumbling. The hours dragged. My phone stayed quiet, except for a few automatic happy birthdays from friends and family. I laughed them off, replying with emojis, pretending everything was fine. But every vibration, every notification felt like a countdown to disappointment. By evening I was dressed, not because I wanted to go out, but because I thought maybe he wanted to surprise me. He'd done that before, disappeared all day, only to come home with flowers and reservations. So I waited. The candles flickered on the table I'd set up myself, soft jazz playing in the background, the smell of my favorite takeout filling the room. 8 o'clock, 9, 10, nothing. I poured myself a glass of wine, then another. I told myself he was stuck in traffic, or maybe with a client, but the truth sat heavy in my chest, pressing harder with every passing minute. When the clock hit 11, I blew out the candles. The wax dripped like tears, slow and pointless. I was just about to turn off the music when I heard his car pull into the driveway. Relief, foolish, hopeful relief washed over me, until I saw him. He walked in with that casual guilt men wear when they think a smile can fix anything. No flowers, no gift, just an apology ready on his tongue. "Babe, I'm so sorry. Work ran late. I didn't even realize." "Don't," I said quietly. I didn't raise my voice, didn't cry. He blinked, confused, maybe surprised by how calm I was. "I didn't forget," he added quickly. "I was going to do something tomorrow. You know, make it up to you." I nodded, and I smiled. The kind of smile that hides more than it shows, because while he talked, his jacket caught my eye, the inside pocket half open, and there, just barely sticking out, was a folded receipt. I almost laughed at how cliché it was. A man, a lie, and a piece of paper that ruins everything. While he went upstairs to shower, I pulled it out. The date, today. The place, Le Rêve, our anniversary restaurant. The same table we sat at on our first date, printed neatly in the corner, and the name scribbled in pen beside the check. Hers, his ex. For a long moment, I just stood there, holding the receipt between my fingers, tracing the ink like it could tell me why he would choose her on my day. It wasn't the forgetting that broke me. It was the remembering how much effort he used to put into pretending I was his everything. Upstairs, I heard the shower running. The water drowned out my heartbeat, my breathing, the shattering sound I could only feel inside. That's when something changed. Not rage, not sorrow, something colder. A kind of silence that only comes when you realize you'll never look at someone the same way again. I poured another glass of wine, sat at the table still dressed in the outfit he was supposed to see, and stared at the receipt. That was the last birthday he'd ever forget, and the last one I'd ever spend waiting.
I sat at that table for almost an hour after he went upstairs. The wine had lost its chill, and the candles were puddles of wax, their flames bending low like they were tired too. I kept turning that receipt over in my hands until the paper felt soft, worn, like it had lived in my pocket for weeks instead of minutes. At first I rehearsed what I might say, the questions, the accusations, the how could yous, but every version sounded smaller than what I felt. How do you confront someone who's already rewritten the story in their head? The shower shut off. I heard the floorboards creak, his drawer slide open, the click of his phone on the charger. Everything normal, too normal. When he came back down, hair damp, t-shirt loose around his shoulders, he smiled at me like nothing had happened, like he hadn't spent the night somewhere else pretending to be single. "Did you eat?" he asked, reaching for a bottle of water. "Not really," I said. "Wasn't that hungry." He nodded, unsuspicious. The kind of nod men give when they think a conversation is over before it's begun. I wanted to laugh at how sure he was. He walked past me toward the couch, scrolling through his phone, and that's when I said it. "How's La Rev?" He froze mid-step. It was almost imperceptible, just a pause, half a breath too long, but I caught it. He turned slowly. "What?" I lifted the receipt between two fingers, letting the soft lamplight reveal the date, the name, the table number. I asked how the food was. "Still as good as you remember." The silence that followed was so thick it felt like it filled the whole room. He blinked, once, twice, searching for a version of the truth that didn't make him the villain. Finally he said, "It's not what you think." I almost pitied him. Almost. Really, because it looks exactly like what I think. He exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "She called me. She wanted to talk, to apologize. I didn't want to make it weird." "You didn't want to make her feel weird." I asked quietly. "What about me?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked so small standing there, like a man who finally realized the ground beneath him was about to give way. "You're overreacting," he muttered. "It was just dinner." There it was. The phrase that would replay in my head for weeks. Just dinner. Something in me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically. It was more like a quiet tear, the kind that splits something invisible but important. I stood up, walked over and placed the receipt in his hand. "Keep it," I said. "It might be the last meal you'll ever enjoy in peace." He blinked, confused, almost amused. "You're not seriously mad," but I'd already walked past him, straight to the hallway closet. From the top shelf I pulled down the small box I kept tucked away, full of things he'd forgotten, anniversary cards, love notes, ticket stubs, all the proof that we used to be something worth remembering. I dropped it on the table. The lid fell open, papers scattering like confetti from a party that never happened. "Look at that," I said, voice steady. "Every single memory we built, every promise, every night you told me I was the only one. You forget birthdays, but you never forget her." He stared at the mess, at me, at his hands. He didn't speak. Maybe he knew there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. I gathered the notes one by one and fed them into the fireplace. The paper curled, turned black, drifted upward in flakes. He stepped forward. "Stop." I turned, eyes on his. "Don't." He froze again. That was the moment he realized he'd lost control, not of the argument, but of the story itself. For years he'd written me as the quiet one, the forgiving one, the woman who stayed. But not this time. I watched the flames until the last corner of the receipt turned to ash. Then I said softly, "You'll never forget my birthday again." That night, I slept in the guest room. He tried knocking once, maybe twice, then gave up. I heard him on the phone, whispering, pacing, probably to her. Maybe trying to explain what had happened, or what he'd been caught in. I didn't care anymore, because the version of me he thought he could play had already disappeared with the smoke. I didn't plan it as revenge at first. I planned it as reclamation. There's a difference. When the receipt burned in the fireplace and the last of our old promises went up in smoke, something unclenched inside me. For the first time in years, the part of me that had been held together with other people's expectations felt whole on its own. The box of memories acted like a fuse. The flame made me realize I didn't owe him quiet anymore. I owed myself the kind of truth that changes the air in the room. The next morning, I woke early. I made coffee. I stood at the window and watched him sleep in our bed for the last time. Not with fury, but with a calmness that felt like armor. My plan had to be simple and clean. No yelling in public restaurants, no scenes outside apartments, no criminality. I wasn't interested in making him suffer in ways that would make me small. I wanted him exposed, the way a liar is exposed, in daylight, with witnesses, with proof that could not be shrugged away. First I catalogued everything. I found the receipt on the floor where it had fallen from his pocket. I took photos of it, close up and clear. I saved them twice, on my phone and in a private cloud folder. I scrolled through old messages, the ones he'd never meant me to see, the ones that now looked clinical in their casualness. I made copies of his calendar entries, dinner at La Rave, reservations, timestamps. I pulled up past photos from our first dates, the table numbers, everything that mapped his deceit. I texted 3 people before noon. Megan, my best friend, Jason, my brother's friend who works in PR, and Nora, a woman I'd met through work who hated being lied to as much as I do. I didn't explain. I sent the receipt, the photos, and one line. "Meet me tonight, 7:30, come hungry." They answered with emojis, a single word, "We're there." The trick with exposure is timing. It has to happen when a lie is most comfortable, when the liar believes they are untouchable. For my husband, that comfort zone was predictable. His ego liked being admired in public. He loved the feeling of being the composed one. He was at his best when others were impressed. So I set the stage where his performance would matter. The same restaurant, the same time, the same table. At noon I called Le Rêve. I asked for a quiet table for two that evening, then changed my mind and asked instead for their private dining room. I explained very calmly that I'd like to host a corporate dinner for a colleague who was being honored. They offered their best menu and complimentary champagne. I booked the exact table from our first date, the table number printed on the receipt, like a cruel bookmark. Then I called his office. I left a message on his assistant's phone. Please confirm Andrew Cole's dinner tonight at Le Rêve client meeting. He will be arriving at 7:45. I typed it out like a favor, watched the typing bubble and pressed send. It was small, petty, and perfect, a seed. At 4 p.m. I posted a simple Instagram story. A cropped photo of a candlelit table, no faces, just the glow. Caption: sometimes the best revenge is showing up to your own life. No tags, no names, but the people who needed to see it did. He came home that night in that same smug, guilty way he always did when he thought a smile could patch anything. I met him at the door, quiet, dressed in black, hair pinned back, makeup almost not there. He hesitated, his face registering that something had shifted about my calm. He couldn't read me. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Out," I said. He narrowed his eyes. "On my birthday? You're really doing this?" There it was, the attempt to flip the narrative, to make me the selfish one. I unlocked the door with deliberate slowness. "You'll see." When we got to the restaurant, the maitre d' greeted us like royalty. He led us past the main dining room to the private room and stopped. The same table. Identical place settings. A small bouquet, the kind we'd once laughed about as being too coupley. There was a hush in the closed room that felt like an audience taking its seats. He stiffened. "You reserved this?" "Yes." My voice was calm, but the way he looked at me was a mixture of confusion and a dawning worry. The staff presented menus. The sommelier offered a bottle from the cellar. I smiled as one does in public when one is holding the threads of something bigger. At 7:25 I tapped my phone. Megan texted, "Outside, Jason, at the bar, Nora by the window." The pieces slid into place. I had them seated in the main room where they could watch the private door, quiet allies who would become witnesses. At 7:35 his phone buzzed. He glanced down. I watched his face, the small white light reflected in his pupils. He considered ignoring it, then stood, wordless, and answered. The conversation was short. His jaw tightened. He smiled once, the practiced smile, then ended the call and sank back into his chair. At 7:45 a woman entered Le Rêve. She was not older than I was, hair pinned in the same careless bun I sometimes wore, an air about her that mixed ease and purpose. She scanned the room, then impossibly casually walked toward the private dining room. The maitre d' recognized her immediately. His smile was warm, too warm for what would come next. She opened the private room door, and then stopped. The woman was not alone. Behind her, in a hush, came my three allies. They took the nearest table and ordered quietly. I could hear the soft clink of cutlery, the ambient hum of other conversations. The restaurant staff, trained in discretion, moved like shadows around the scene. She smiled at my husband like a ghost from a past he'd thought he'd left behind. He returned the smile, but it was brittle now. His hands trembled in a way that had nothing to do with candlelight. They sat. She leaned in. He laughed. And then, almost without drama, a second maitre d' approached the private room and quietly slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand. The receipt. The same receipt. The proof I'd been nursing like a small hot coal. The maitre d' left, eyes apologetic, and for a moment, time slowed. "Forgive me," I said, and I smiled. The tone of the room changed. Conversations in the main dining room dimmed. I watched the woman's face at the table. She looked like a person who didn't yet understand she was about to be part of a story that would define an evening. I stood. I walked to the private door and opened it. The sound of my heels against the hardwood felt loud in my ears. He looked up, startled. "Ella?" "Yes," I said. "Hi." She stood, face composed, nodding politely. The maitre d' hovered at the door, uncertain. People in the main room glanced toward the private room like they'd been waiting for a scene. I didn't want to humiliate someone who had been hurt into being complicit in a relationship. I wanted transparency. So I did the thing that would make everything clear. Not because I wanted to destroy, but because I wanted to cease being erased. "Do you remember Le Rêve?" I asked him, keeping my voice light. "The first table we sat at? The one we booked the night we said we'd try?" He looked bewildered. He glanced at the woman. This is Ella. That was a long time ago." I opened my phone and showed him the dated photo from the receipt. I turned it so the woman could see her own name, and the tiny handwriting beside the itemized bill, the scribble of initials that matched the ex's name tucked under his jacket. I kept my face neutral as the evidence settled between us like a stone. "How is tonight any different from that memory you love so much?" I asked him. "You said you wanted to remember our first date. Tonight you recreated it for her. He opened his mouth. Nothing serious came out, just stammered denials and fumbling for excuses. People in the main room turned to watch, a murmur rising like a tide. Then I did something I'd rehearsed in my head but never quite believed I would do. I asked the maitre d' to bring the bill for the private room. He complied. When he set it down, it was folded and stamped, identical to the one I'd found. I slid my phone back into my pocket and gestured to the woman. "You and my husband have dinner together in public," I said evenly, "and I'm the one who sits at home with candles. Why is that the story you get to tell?" She blinked, and I could see the flicker of recognition, the moment a person understands they aren't the only actor on a stage. People in the main room leaned in. The restaurant was small enough that whispers traveled like wind. My husband stood. His face was pale. He began to argue, to explain, to say things about forgiveness and closure. But the words felt thin in a room where everyone could see the receipts. That's when Megan stood up. She walked to the head of the table, and without raising her voice, because shame does not need volume to be felt, she said loud enough that nearby tables heard, "Is this a private celebration or a recycled memory?" She set her hand on the table, because if it's the latter, it's weird. And if it's the former, I'd hate to ruin the surprise. Jason recorded innocuously, as if he'd been reminiscing. He didn't. He tapped his phone once, twice, and a photo of the receipt, high resolution, time-stamped, flashed on the screens of the people in the main room. People looked at their phones and then at the private room. Conversation shifted into the kind of quiet that ascends to the level of judgment. He tried to laugh it off. He tried to shift blame onto a misunderstanding. But the woman at the table, the one he'd been dining with, suddenly saw what curiosity had hidden. She was not a private moment. She was a part of a visible pattern. People who think they are invisible in a relationship forget that the world is always watching. When he realized the reality of the moment, that this wasn't going to be a small private lie anymore, he went red, as if the paper could burn him from the inside out. The woman stood up slowly, her face shuddered, and walked toward the exit. She paused, looked at me once, and in that look I saw a whole lifetime of apologies ready but unsaid. I watched her walk out, small under the restaurant's low lights. My husband stayed. He looked at me as if pleading for gentleness I had no intention of giving. "You'll never forget this night," I said softly to him and to the room. He didn't have to. By breakfast his phone was full of texts from colleagues asking if everything was okay. By lunch his assistant was fielding questions. By the next day his client meeting canceled itself. By the week's end he was shuffled into an awkward HR-mandated leave, a manager suddenly concerned about focus and company reputation. His leadership called him in. His reputation, which relied heavily on the illusion of stability and discretion, cracked like cheap plaster. I didn't cause every consequence. I lit the spark. But the atmosphere, the culture that favors men who can compartmentalize other lives, did the rest. People who had been impressed by his calm started to see the man behind it. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't always need a microphone. It needs witnesses. In the following days I got messages. Some were cruel, accusations about my behavior. Others were quieter, private, from strangers, acquaintances, old friends. "I'm so sorry, I had no idea. Thank you for showing us. I wish someone had told me sooner." People I'd never expected to reach out confided stories that suddenly made sense. He tried to retaliate with the usual tools: charm, minimization, the old "we're fine" message to our circle. But the receipts were real. The calendar invitations had been sent to a work address. There were emails with subjects like ketchup, and threads showing apology dinners, more than apology. His attempts to gaslight faltered because everyone could see where the edges of his story had been cut. That week, he packed 2 suitcases. He left the house, to his mother's, he said. Later, someone told me he'd moved in with the woman. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. Watching the hollowed-out man who had once felt untouchable walk away with his boxes was a kind of justice I didn't have to manufacture. My friends asked if I wanted a statement, if I wanted to make it public, to narrate everything. I declined. Some things are better left cold and simple. Receipts, timestamps, the faint smell of perfume on a jacket. Let the evidence stand for itself. People are smarter than you think. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt the edges of my life like a mason rebuilding a wall, carefully, brick by brick. I wrote a post that night, not a confession, not a threat, just a truth. People choose. Sometimes they choose themselves. Sometimes they don't choose at all. It had no names. It didn't need them. Comments poured in, stories, support, the kind of solidarity that feels like clean water. He tried to reach me several times. His messages started polite, then pleading, then angered as the world continued to react to him as a man who'd been caught rather than the victim he wanted to be. I read them once, answered just once, "Don't contact me again," and then muted him. Months passed. The woman's name, the one on the receipt, circulated for 5 minutes in the gossip chain, then disappeared. People moved on. The world always does. But the lesson didn't wash away. I kept the burned corner of that receipt. I slid it into the last page of an old journal and closed it. When friends asked if I felt triumphant, I would say something truthful and quiet. I feel free. Because that was what it was. Not happiness as a triumph over him, but relief. Proof that my life wasn't something to be managed by other people's appetites. The pleasure of my life was mine to arrange, alone, or with someone honest, and that was enough. A year later, at a small gathering of people who had watched me rebuild, someone raised a glass to new beginnings. I smiled and raised mine. The room was full of people who had chosen to stay, and people who had chosen to leave. That made sense to me now. People are allowed to choose. In the end, the sweetest thing wasn't the spectacle. It wasn't the firing or the shame. It was that I stopped waking up in the morning waiting for apologies, for mending, for someone else's rhythm to set mine. I started making plans on my own timetable. I went back to the things that used to make me glow. Writing, small trips, friends who told the truth as kindly or as harshly as needed. The receipt never left the journal. Some nights when the house is quiet and the scent of lemon from the counter fills the air, I take the journal down and look at the corner of ink that saved me. I seal it between pages and think of the way the candles burned that night, melting, bright, and then gone. The flame had done what it was meant to do. It had shown the shape of what remained. If he remembers that night, that's his burden. If the world remembers him differently now, that's also his burden. I have no hunger for revenge anymore. I have appetite for life. And that, more than anything, is what he'll never be able to take back.